Chapter 1: The Origins of the Civil War, 1820 to 1861. In the early 19th century, most Americans were proud of the achievements of their country and optimistic about its future. There seemed good cause for optimism. The USA had the most democratic system of government in the world. It was also one of the world's most prosperous nations. However, the USA did face a serious problem that was to do with the fact that northern and southern states were growing apart. Economically, socially, culturally, and politically, most of the North-South differences and disagreements were concerned with the issue of slavery. The problems arising from slavery eventually resulted in the outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861. 1.1 How was the issue of slavery addressed between 1820 and 1850? By the mid-19th century, there was one main issue which divided Americans more than any other. This was the issue of slavery. Most Southerners supported their peculiar institution. Most Northerners opposed it. The problem of slavery was made worse by the USA's political system and the impact of westward expansion. Between 1820 and 1850, politicians struggled to find compromises which would ensure that the United States remained united. The U.S. political system and the balance of sectional interests. The 1787 Constitution created a system whereby power would be divided between the central or federal government in Washington and the individual states. The federal government had well-defined executive, legislative, and judicial branches, each of which was able to check the actions of the other. State governments tended to replicate the federal government. Each state had its own government, its own legislative body, and its own Supreme Court. In the late 18th century, the USA had devised a system for admitting new states. New areas first assumed territorial status, electing a territorial government. Once the population of a territory reached 60,000, it could submit its proposed constitution to Congress and apply to become a state. In 1820, there were 23 states. By 1850, the USA comprised 30 states. The Constitution implicitly accepted slavery because, for the purpose of counting population to work out each state's representation in the House of Representatives, each slave was considered to be 3/5 of a free person. American democracy. By the 1820s, the USA was far more democratic than the rest of the world. Even women and most blacks, African American, could not vote. Almost all white males could do so. By the 1830s, the USA had two major political parties, Democrats and the Whigs. The parties, although operating nationally, were not particularly united. They were really an assortment of state parties that only came together every 4 years to nominate a presidential candidate and devise a national platform. Democrats believe that most issues should be decided at state, not federal level. They opposed government intervention in economic matters and supported the lowering of tariffs. Whigs were more likely to favor government intervention in economic and social matters and supported higher tariffs. Limited government. Given that it was usual for one party to control the presidency, both houses of the Congress and the Supreme Court at the same time, it was often difficult for the federal government to bring about any change. The fact that many matters were seen as state, not federal concerns was another limiting factor. Presidents were more figureheads and distributors of patronage than active policymakers. Congress, only in session from December to March, rarely passed major legislation. State legislators had more influence on Americans' day-to-day lives than the federal government. Sectional interests. The United States had never been particularly united. For much of the early 19th century, there were rivalries between the newer western states and the established eastern states. Far more important, however, were the differences between North and South. Some historians have underplayed the differences, stressing instead that the similarities between the two sections, the common language, the shared religion, the same legal, political, and racial assumptions, and the celebration of the same history. Other historians, however, believe that there were deep divisions that helped to bring about the Civil War. Economic differences. There were economic differences between North and South. The North developed more industry and relied more on mixed farming and free labor. The South was characterized by large-scale cultivation of crops like cotton and tobacco, which relied on slave labor. However, it is important not to generalize. Historians once claimed that the Civil War was a conflict between a backward, agrarian, planter-dominated South and a modern, industrialized, and egalitarian North. This view is far too sweeping. In reality, there was not one but many Souths, encompassing several distinct geographical regions. Eastern states such as Virginia were very different from newer western states like Mississippi. The lower South was different from the upper South. Accordingly, it is difficult to generalize about the old South. There were also many Norths. Moreover, in many respects, these Norths were not dissimilar economically to the Souths. The North was industrializing, not industrialized. In 1820, fewer than 1 in 10 Americans lived in towns, defined as settlements with more than 2,500 people. 1 in 5 did so by 1860. Nor was the South economically backward. By the mid-19th century, Southern cotton sales made up at least half of the USA's total exports. Slavery apart, the North was not more egalitarian than the South. In 1820, the typical Northerner was a self-sufficient farmer owning 50 to 500 acres of land. The same were true for Southerners. In 1820, two-thirds of Southern families did not own slaves. Planters, who comprised less than 5% of the white population, owned the South's best farmland and the major portion of its wealth, including most of its slaves. The historian Eugene Genesov believed that the planters led Southern politics and set the tone of social life. However, in the North, a minority of wealthy men widened similar influence. North-South differences. North was more industrial. The southern states, with about 35% of the USA's population, produced only 10% of the nation's manufactured output by 1850. The North was more urban in 1850. Only 6 of the USA's largest 30 cities were southern. Between 1820 and 1860, most of the 5 million immigrants to the USA settled in the North. Thus, 1 in 6 Northerners in 1860 was foreign-born compared with 1 in 30 Southerners. Southern economic grievances. The two sections had different economic interests. The tariff was a source of constant grievance to most Southerners, who argued that it benefited Northern industrialists at the expense of Southern farmers. The South also felt exploited in other ways. Southerners depended upon Northern credit to finance the growing of cotton, tobacco, sugar, and rice. They relied upon Northerners to market these goods, and they were reliant on Northern ships to transport them. Inevitably, much of these profits from King Cotton ended up in pockets of Northern businessmen. Values. There was a general Southern belief that old agrarian ways and values were better than those of the Yankees. The historian Wyatt Brown, 1982, claimed that Southerners were more concerned about their personal honor than Northerners. In Brown's view, Southern males were highly sensitive to personal insult, reacting violently to even trivial incidents, including resorting to dueling. There were other differences. Northerners were more responsive to new ideas. Southerners, by contrast, tended to oppose radical isms, viewing them as a threat to old values and institutions. Slavery. The main difference between the sections and the main reason for the growth of sectionalism was slavery. In 1776, slavery existed in what was then all the 13 colonies of British America. However, it was of major importance only in the South, largely because the northern climate was not suited to plantation agriculture. In the late 18th century, radical protests condemned slavery as a moral evil. Other Americans thought it inconsistent with enlightened ideas that stressed liberty, equality, and free enterprise. After independence from Britain, northern states abolished slavery, some at a stroke, others gradually. In 1787, Congress passed an ordinance that kept slavery out of the Northwest Territory. In 1808, the USA banned the slave trade with Africa. Cotton ensured that slavery survived and thrived. In 1790, only 9,000 bales of cotton were produced in the USA, but E.O. Whitney's invention of a cotton engine, or gin, in 1793 enabled Southern short fiber cotton to be quickly separated from its seed. Suddenly, it became highly profitable to grow cotton. By the 1830s, the South was producing 2 million bales per year. Cotton outstripped all other plantation crops in economic importance. Such was the demand, mainly from Britain, and such were the profits that the cotton belts spread westward. Cotton production needed a large quantity of unskilled labor to pick the cotton. Slave labor was ideal. Abolitionists. Most abolitionists in the early 19th century supported gradual emancipation, freeing the slaves over a period of time with the slave owners receiving some financial compensation. Abolitionists also believed that free slaves should be encouraged to return to Africa. In 1822, the USA purchased Liberia on the west coast of Africa as a base for returning ex-slaves. However, only 10,000 blacks had returned to Africa by 1860. In the same period, the USA's slave population increased by 2 million. There were never enough funds to free and then transport more than a fraction of slaves. Moreover, most ex-slaves had no wish to move to Liberia. Militant abolitionism. In the early 1830s, a new and far more forceful abolitionist movement developed. This was associated with William Lloyd Garrison, who in 1831 launched a new abolitionist struggle, the Liberator. Convinced that slavery was a sin, Garrison demanded immediate abolishment, though he did not actually mention how it should be done. In 1833, a militant national anti-slavery society was established. By 1838, it had 250,000 members. Most of its leaders were well-educated and fairly wealthy. Women and free blacks played crucial roles. Helped by a new steam-driven printing press, abolitionists churned out a massive anti-slavery literature. They also organized massive petitions to Congress. To prevent North-South division, Congress introduced the gag rule in 1836, which ensured that abolitionist petitions were not discussed. Some historians stress that militant abolitionism was part of a worldwide phenomenon in which Britain in particular played an important role. Others stress American roots. Mid-19th century, America was a religious society, and the church had a powerful effect on most people's lives. Most Americans were Protestants, Baptists, Methodists, Unitarians, Presbyterians, and Episcopalians. In the early 19th century, there was an upsurge in evangelical Protestantism, known as the Second Great Awakening. Evangelical preachers fired up Americans to do battle against the sins of the world, including slavery. Abolitionist problems in the North. The abolitionist movement had only limited appeal in the North. Many Northerners, fearing an exodus of liberated slaves to their state, hated the abolitionists. Anti-slavery meetings were broken up by angry mobs. In 1837, Elijah Lovejoy became the first abolitionist martyr when he was murdered in Illinois. Failing to win the support of either the Whig or Democratic Party, abolitionists set up the Libertarian Party in 1840. Its presidential candidate won only 7,000 votes. Abolitionists were unable to agree on their general strategy. This resulted in a major division in the anti-slavery society in 1840. Nevertheless, despite their problems, the abolitionists did stir the consensus of a growing number of Northerns and kept slavery at the forefront of public attention. Abolitionist problems in the South. The abolitionists had no success whatsoever in winning support from Southern whites. They were not helped by the fact that in 1831, Nat Turner, a slave in Virginia, led a slave revolt in which 55 whites were killed. The revolt was quickly crushed, and Turner and other rebellious slaves killed or executed. Nevertheless, the revolt appalled Southerners who blamed abolitionists for inciting trouble among slaves. Abolitionist attacks provoked Southerners to praise the virtues of their peculiar institution. Southern writers now argue that slavery was a positive good rather than a necessary evil. History, religion, anthropology, and economics were all used to defend slavery, as well as vigorously defending slavery in print and in words. Southern authorities also took action against abolitionists. In some southern states, the penalty for circulating incendiary literature among blacks was death. Southerners suspected of having abolitionist sympathies were driven out. The nature of slavery. In 1860, there were nearly 4 million slaves compared to 8 million whites in the 15 southern states. They were concentrated mainly in the lower South. In 1850, 1 in 3 white southern families owned slaves. By 1860, 1 family in 4 were slave owners. In 1860, 50% of slave owners owned fewer than 5 slaves. Over 50% of slaves lived on plantations with over 20 slaves. Thus, the typical slaveholder did not own the typical slave. Most slaves were held by 10,000 families. Of all slaves, 55% worked in cotton production, 10% in tobacco, 10% in sugar, rice, and hemp, while 15% were domestic servants and 10% lived in towns or worked in industry. Free blacks. By 1860, there were about 250,000 free blacks in the South. Most of these were of mixed race and had been given their freedom by their white fathers. Southern free blacks had to carry documentation proving their freedom at all times or risk of the danger of being enslaved. They had no political rights and their legal status was precarious. Some 200,000 blacks lived in the North. Many Northern whites were as radically prejudiced as Southerners. Northern blacks usually had the worst jobs and segregation was the norm in most aspects of life. Only 3 states allowed blacks to vote on equal terms with whites in 1860. Some northern states tried to exclude blacks from voting altogether. The future of slavery. Some historians have argued that once cotton prices fell, then slavery would have eventually died of its own accord. If this is correct, the bloodletting of the Civil War was unnecessary. However, in 1860, there was still a worldwide demand for cotton and thus no economic reason for believing slavery was about to die out. Moreover, slavery was not simply an economic institution, it was also a system of social control. It kept blacks in their place and ensured white supremacy. Southerners feared that an end to slavery would result in economic collapse, social disruption, disintegration, and race war. Thus, slaveholders and non-slaveholders alike were committed to the peculiar institution, so committed that, ultimately, they were prepared to secede, withdraw formally from the Union, and wage a terrible war in an effort to maintain it. Given this commitment, it is difficult to see how slavery would have ended without the Civil War. Conclusion. By the mid-19th century, there were significant differences between North and South. Differences that were growing at the North's industrial development outstripped that of the South. The North was changing. The South resisted change. By 1850, Southerners were conscious of their distinct Southernness. North and South might speak the same language, but by the mid-19th century, as the historian James McPherson, 1988, had pointed out, they were increasingly using this language to attack each other. Even the shared commitment to Protestantism had become a divisive rather than a unifying factor, with most of the major denominations splitting into hostile Southern and Northerner branches over the question of slavery. The impact of territorial expansion, westward expansion, and the absorption of Texas. In the early 19th century, Americans moved west and filled the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. By 1819, the original 13 states had grown to 22. Of these, 11 states were free, 11 were slave. Further westward expansion threatened to tilt the sectional balance in favor of the North or South. Northern states wanted new Western states to be free states. Southern states, by contrast, wanted them to be slave states. This caused political problems throughout the period 1820 to 1850. The Missouri Compromise. In 1819, Missouri applied to join the Union as a slave state. Given that this would tilt the balance against them, northern states opposed Mississippi's admittance. The result was a series of furious debates, with southern and northern congressmen lined up against each other. In 1820, a compromise was worked out. To balance the admittance of Missouri, a new free state of Maine was created. It was also agreed that henceforth there would be no slavery in the Louisiana Purchase territory, north of latitude 36 degrees and 30. South of that line, slavery could exist. Texan independence. Americans had settled in Texas, then part of Mexico, from the 1820s. Most were Southerners, and many had taken their slaves with them. In 1829, Mexico passed a law to free its slaves, and in 1830 prohibited further American immigration into Texas. American Texans defied both laws, and for some years the Mexican government was too weak to enforce its authority. By 1835, there were about 30,000 American immigrants in Texas and about 5,000 slaves, and only about 5,000 Mexicans. The efforts of the Mexican president Santa Anna to enforce Mexican authority were resented by the American Texans, and over the winter of 1835 to 1836, they declared independence. Santa Anna marched north with a large army. A force of 187 Texans put up a spirited defense at the Alamo, fortified mission near San Antonio, but this fell in March 1836. All the Texan defenders were killed, although U.S. President Andrew Jackson, 1929 to 1937, sympathized with the Texans. He sent no official help. Although U.S. President Andrew Jackson, 1829 to 1837, sympathized with Texans, he sent no official help. However, hundreds of Americans from the South and West rushed to the Texans' aid. In April 1836, an American Texan army led by Sam Houston defeated the Mexicans at the Battle of San Jacinto. Santa Anna was captured and forced to recognize Texan independence, Texas and the USA. Although the Mexican government did not ratify Santa Anna's action, Texas was now effectively independent. Most Texans with Southern support hoped to join the USA. However, many Northerners opposed the move, fearing that it would lead to the expansion of slavery. Texas was so large that it could feasibly be divided into 5 new states, which would tilt the balance between free and slave states heavily in the South's favor. Given that Texas was a major political problem, President Andrew Jackson shelved the issue. So too did his successor Martin Van Buren, Democratic president from 1837 to 1841. The result was that for a few years, Texas was an independent republic, unrecognized by Mexico and rejected by the USA. Texas became a major issue in the 1844 presidential election, fought between the Whig Henry Clay and the Democrat James Polk. Polk, a slaveholder from Tennessee, was elected president on a platform that promised the annexation takeover of both Texas and Oregon, an area claimed by Britain. Outgoing Whig President Tyler, anxious to leave his mark on events, now secured a joint resolution of Congress in favor of Texas's annexation. Thus, Texas was admitted into the Union as a single state in 1845. Manifest Destiny. Polk, committed to Western expansion, wished to annex California and New Mexico provinces, over which Mexico exerted little control. Americans were starting to settle in both areas, and the Mexican population was small. In 1845, Democrat journalist John O. Sullivan declared that it was the USA's manifest destiny to control the North American continent. Many Northerners saw this argument as a smokescreen aimed at concealing the evil intent of expanding slavery. The outbreak of war with Mexico. The USA's annexation of Texas angered Mexico, which still claimed sovereignty over the state. The fact that were disputed boundaries between Texas and Mexico was a further problem. The barely concealed designs of Polk on California and New Mexico did not help American-Mexican relations. When efforts to reach a negotiated agreement failed, Polk sent U.S. troops into the disputed border area north of the Rio Grande River, hoping to provoke an incident that would result in a war which would lead to the annexation of California and New Mexico to the USA. In May 1846, Mexican troops duly ambushed a party of U.S. troops in the disputed area, killing or wounding 16 men. Polk declared that Mexicans had shed American blood on American soil and asked Congress to declare war. Congress obliged. While most Southerners and Westerners supported the war, many Northerners saw it as a Southern war of aggression. The Mexican War. Although the USA had a smaller army, it had twice as many people and a much stronger industrial base than Mexico, and thus far greater military potential. Mexican forces were poorly led and equipped. The USA had several further advantages: superior artillery, a pool of junior officers, most of whom had been well trained at West Point Military Academy, enthusiastic, mainly Southern and Western volunteers, naval supremacy. In the summer of 1846, U.S. troops, led by Colonel Kearny, annexed New Mexico. They then marched to California. By the time they arrived, the province was largely under U.S. control. American settlers had proclaimed independence from Mexico. They were helped by Colonel John C. Fremont in the rain on an exploratory expedition, and by a U.S. naval squadron conveniently stationed off the Californian coast. Kearny's arrival in December 1846 ended what little Mexican resistance remained. Polk hoped that Mexico would accept defeat and the loss of New Mexico and California, but Santa Anna, once again in control of Mexico, refused to surrender. The USA's war heroes were General Zachary Taylor and General Winfield Scott. In February 1847, General Zachary Taylor defeated the Mexicans at Buena Vista. Scott, with only 11,000 men, marched 260 miles inland over difficult terrain, storming several fortresses before capturing Mexico City in September 1847. By autumn of 1847, the Mexican War was essentially over. It had cost the Americans $100 million and the death of 13,000 soldiers. The USA was now in a position to enforce peace. Some Southerners called for the annexation of the whole of Mexico. However, many Northerners wanted to annex no territory whatsoever. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. By the Treaty of Guadalupe, California and New Mexico, including present-day Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, were seceded. to the USA. This makes up 2/5 of the USA's present territory. President Polk was unhappy with the treaty despite the fact that the USA had gained everything it had gone to war for. He thought that even more territory could have been gained. Spurred on by Southerners who saw the dizzying prospect of dozens of new slave states, Polk considered rejecting the treaty. However, given Northern opinion and the fact that some Southerners had no wish to rule Mexico's mixed Spanish and Indian population, he reluctantly accepted the treaty, which was ratified by the Senate in May 1848. The impact of population growth and movement. The USA had enormous reserves of almost every commodity: land, timber, and minerals. Between 1800 and 1850, the USA's GNP increased sevenfold, and the average American's income doubled. This encouraged population growth, as did Western expansion and immigration. The USA's population grew rapidly in the early 19th century. In 1820, it had been just over 9.5 million. By 1840, it stood at 17 million. By 1850, it had reached 23 million. By then, more than 1 in 2 Americans lived west of the Appalachians, largely due to the opening up of vast new tracts of land. Most of the population growth came from natural increase. The average woman had 5 children. Population growth was also the result of immigration, especially from Britain, Ireland, and Germany. Southern fears. In 1820, there had been a similar number of Southerners to Northerners, but by 1850, Northerners outnumbered Southerners by more than 3 to 2. This was largely because most immigrants settled in northern states. The fact that there was a widening disparity in numbers between North and South concerned Southerners. Given that northern states had more seats in the House of Representatives, Southerners were determined to maintain a position of equality in the Senate. This meant that westward expansion was a crucial issue because each new state resulted in 2 more senators in Congress. Attempts at compromise. In 1819 to 1820, U.S. politicians had been able to resolve the problems of Missouri, a problem that had threatened to tear the Union apart. However, politicians found it more difficult to deal with the problems which arose, ironically, from American success in the Mexican War. The impact of the Mexican War, 1846 to 1850. Northerners and Southerners were divided over the Mexican War before it began. They remained divided during it and were even more divided by the end of it. Anticipating winning territory from Mexico at the start of the war, American politicians could not agree whether states created from Mexican land should become slave or free. The Wilmot Proviso. In 1846, David Wilmot, a Northern Democrat, proposed in the House of Representatives that slavery should be excluded from any territory gained from Mexico. Wilmot was not an abolitionist like many Northern Democrats. Wilmot resented the fact that Polk seemed to be pursuing a pro-Southern policy. While happy to fight the Mexican War, Polk went back on his promise to take the whole of Oregon. Instead, an agreement had been reached whereby Britain took the area north of the 49th parallel and the USA took southern Oregon. This made sense. The USA did well out of the deal, and it would have been foolish to have fought both Mexico and Britain. Nevertheless, Northern Democrats disliked Polk's seeming pro-Southern bias. In supporting the proviso, Northern Democrats hoped to keep blacks out of new territories and ensure that white settlers would not face competition from slave planters. Concerned at the coming midterm elections, Northern Democrats were warning Polk of their unease with the direction of his policies. After a bitter debate, the proviso narrowly passed the House of Representatives by 83 votes to 64. The voting was sectional. Every Southern Democrat and all but 2 Southern Whigs voted against it. Most Northerners voted for it. Senator Toombs of Georgia
warned that if the proviso became law, he would favor disunion rather than disgradation. However, the proviso did not become law as it failed to pass the Senate. Nevertheless, for anti-slavery forces, the proviso became a rallying cry. Many northern states' legislatures endorsed it. Most southern states denounced it. The Calhoun Doctrine. Northerners believed that Congress had the power to exclude slavery from the territories that should exercise their power. Southerners responded aggressively to this threat, not least John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, who had been largely responsible for the nullification crisis in 1847. He issued a series of resolutions in which he claimed that citizens from every state had the right to take their property to any territory. Congress, he asserted, had no authority to place restrictions on slavery in the territories. If the northern majority continued to disregard the rights of the southern majority, southern states would have little option but to secede. The search for compromise. Moderate politicians, fearful that the issue could destroy the Union, tried to find a compromise. The most successful idea was the notion of popular sovereignty. Associated with two Midwestern Democrats, Senator Lewis Cass and Senator Stephen Douglas, they argued that it was not Congress which should decide on whether a territory should allow slaves, that decisions should be made instead by the people in that territory. Consistent with democracy and self-government, popular sovereignty seemed to offer something to both sections. It met the Southerners' wish for federal non-intervention and held out the prospect that slavery might be extended to some of the former Mexican territories. It could be presented to the North as the exclusion scheme because it was unlikely that settlers in the new territories would vote for slavery's introduction. There were problems with popular sovereignty. Firstly, it went against previous practice. In the past, Congress had decided on what should happen in the territories. Did popular sovereignty mean it no longer had that power? Then there were practical differences, not least when exactly a territory should decide on the slavery question. Nevertheless, popular sovereignty was supported by many Democrats. It was opposed by those Southerners who thought they had the right to take their property anywhere, and by those Northerners who believed that slavery should not be allowed to expand under any circumstances. The 1848 election. Worn out by constant opposition, Polk did not seek a second term. The Democrats rallying round the concept of popular sovereignty chose Lewis Cass as their presidential candidate. The Whigs nominated Mexican war hero Zachary Taylor. The fact that he was a slave owner from Louisiana did not endear him to abolitionists. Nevertheless, many Northern Whigs were prepared to endorse Taylor, if only because he seemed like a likely winner. A new party, for the Free Soil Party, which supported the Wilmot Proviso, was formed to fight the election. It introduced a number of Northern Democrats who disliked Cass' concisive Whigs, who disliked Taylor, and Liberty Party supporters. Former President Martin Van Buren was nominated as his presidential candidate. The election was a triumph for Taylor, who won 1,360,000 votes and 163 electoral college votes. Cass won 220,000 votes and 127 electoral votes. Van Buren won 291,000 votes, but no electoral votes. Taylor's victory was not sectional. He carried 8 of the 5 slave states, 7 of the 15 slave states, and 7 of the 15 free states, California and New Mexico. Few Americans had thought that California or New Mexico would speedily apply for statehood because both areas seemed to have little to offer settlers. But the discovery of gold in California led to the 1848 to 49 gold rush within months. There were 100,000 people in California, more than enough to enable the area to apply for statehood. New Mexico had fewer people, however. Thousands of Mormons had settled around Salt Lake City in 1846 to 1847. As a result of the Mexican War, they found themselves under U.S. jurisdiction. President Taylor determined to act decisively, hoping that a quick solution to the California-New Mexico problem might reduce the potential for sectional strife. He encouraged settlers in the area to frame constitutions and apply immediately for admission to the Union without first going through the process of establishing territorial governments. In 1849, California duly ratified a proposed state constitution prohibiting slavery and applied for admission to the Union. Taylor was also prepared to admit New Mexico, even though it did not have enough power to apply for statehood. There was a further problem with New Mexico. It had a boundary dispute with Texas. Southerners supported Texas's claim, Northerners supported New Mexico's claim. A clash between Texan state forces and the U.S. Army suddenly seemed imminent. Southern resentment. Taylor's actions enraged Southerners, Democrats, and Whigs alike. Having won the war against Mexico, most believed they were now being excluded from the territory gained. In October 1849, Mississippi issued a call to all slave states to send representatives to a convention to meet at Nashville. In June 1850, to devise and adopt some mode of resistance to Northern aggression. Bitter sectional divisions were reflected in Congress, which met in December 1849, as well as fierce debates over slavery expansion. Southerners also raised the issues of fugitive slaves, claiming that many northern states were breaking the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act and frustrating slaveholders' efforts to catch runaways and return them to the South. Northerners, by contrast, objected to the fact that slavery was allowed in Washington. The 1850 Compromise. President Taylor determined to make no concessions to the South. If necessary, he was ready to lead an army into the South to prevent secession. However, many politicians from Midwest states, including Whig elder statesman Henry Clay, were worried by the events and felt that something had to be done to calm the anger of Southerners. In January 1850, Clay, who had been instrumental in the 1820 Missouri Compromise, offered the Senate a set of resolutions as a basis for a compromise. California was to be admitted as a free state. Utah and New Mexico were to be organized as territories without any mention of or restriction on slavery. Slave trading, but not slavery, should end in Washington. A more stringent Fugitive Slave Act should be passed to placate the South. In order to resolve the Texas-New Mexican dispute, Texas should surrender the disputed land to New Mexico. In return, Congress would assume the $10 million public debt that Texas still owed. The next few months were marked by a series of epic speeches as Clay's proposal rolled into a single omnibus bill were debated in Congress. The more moderate and conciliatory politicians such as Clay and Daniel Webster gained little support. With every call for a compromise, some Northern or Southern speakers would inflame passions. The end of the crisis. In June 1850, delegates from 9 slave states met at Nashville. The fact that 6 slave states did not send delegates was disconcerting to those fire eaters who supported secession. Moreover, the convention displayed little enthusiasm for secession. The Nashville Convention therefore had little impact. Taylor's death in July had a greater impact. Vice President Millard Fillmore, a Northerner who was sympathetic to the South, now became president. Unlike Taylor, he supported Clay's bill, but he could not prevent it being defeated. Senator Douglas now demonstrated his political skill. Instead of reintroducing Clay's bill in its entirety, he submitted each of its parts separately. This strategy was successful. Southerners and Northerners voted separately for these proposals they liked. Moderates, like Douglas himself, swung the balance. By September 1850, all the parts had passed through Congress. Douglas and the other leaders hailed the compromise as a settlement of the issue that threatened to divide the nation. Many Northerners believed that Congress had surrendered to Southern threats. However, the North probably gained more than the South from the compromise. The entry of California into the Union gave the free states a majority in the Senate. The resolution on New Mexico and Utah were hollow victories for the South. The odds were that both areas would enter the Union as free states at some time in the future. The Fugitive Slave Act was the North's only major concession. Summary: slavery was the crucial issue dividing Northerners from Southerners in the early 19th century. By 1850, Northerners outnumbered Southerners by a ratio of more than 3 to 2. This meant that free states had more seats in the House of Representatives. Accordingly, Southerners were determined to maintain a position of equality in the Senate. Westward expansion thus became a crucial issue because each new state sent 2 senators to Congress. Southerners feared that slavery would be declared illegal by a Northern-dominated Congress. Although relatively few Northerners were abolitionists, most were determined to prevent slavery's expansion. A series of sectional confrontations arose between 1820 and 1850, but politicians eventually agreed to compromises. For example, the 1820 Missouri Compromise and the 1850 Compromise. 1.2. How and why did sectional divisions widen between 1850 and 1856? Most Americans seemed prepared to accept the 1850 Compromise across the USA. There were mass meetings to celebrate its passage in the Southern state elections of 1851 to 1852. Unionist candidates defeated secessionists. Nevertheless, Northern-Southern tensions continued to simmer, and problems were to arise from the implementation of the 1850 Compromise, not least the application of the Fugitive Slave Act. Problems arising from the implementation of the 1850 Compromise and the application of the Fugitive Slave Act. While some Northerners accepted the Fugitive Slave Act as the price the North had to pay to save the Union, however, it contained a number of features that were outrageous to abolitionists. For example, it authorized federal marshals to raise posses to pursue fugitives on Northern soil. Those who refused to join risked a $1,000 fine. In addition, the law targeted not only recent runaways but also those who had fled the South decades earlier. Only efforts to catch and return fugitive slaves inflamed feelings. During the 1850s, 9 northern states passed new personal liberty laws. By such provisions as forbidding the use of state jails to imprison alleged fugitives, the liberty laws made it difficult to enforce federal law. Such actions caused huge resentment in the South. The impact of Uncle Tom's Cabinet. The 1851 Harriet Beecher Stowe began publishing Uncle Tom's Cabinet in weekly installments in an anti-slavery newspaper. The complete novel, which presented a fierce attack on slavery, sold 300,000 copies when it was published in 1852, and a further 2 million copies in America over the next 10 years. Even those Northerners who did not read it were familiar with its theme because it was turned into songs and plays. Stowe, who had little first-hand knowledge of slavery, drew heavily on abolitionist literature when describing its brutalities. This book undoubtedly helped arose Northern sympathy for slaves. The 1852 presidential election. The Democrats were confident of victory in 1852. They expected the large numbers of Irish and German immigrants to support them. The Democrats chose Franklin Pierce as their president candidate, although he had a northern although he was a northerner, he was sympathetic to the South. The Democrats campaigned on a platform supporting the 1850 Compromise and popular sovereignty. The Whig Party was divided, North against South. While most Northerners supported Mexican war hero General Winfield Scott, most Southern Whigs hoped to retain Millard Fillmore. Scott was finally nominated on the 53rd ballot. Although they managed to agree on a leader, the Whigs could not agree on policies. Thus, their platform said virtually nothing. The election was a triumph for Pierce, who won 1,601,274 votes and carried 27 states, 254 electoral college votes. Scott won 1,386,580 votes, but carried only 4 states, 42 electoral college votes. John Hale, the Free Soil Party candidate, won 156,000 votes, carrying not a single state. President Pierce, 1853 to 1857. President Pierce seemed to be in a strong position in 1853. Despite the problems arising from the implementation of the 1850 Compromise, the Democrats had large majorities in both houses of Congress. The economy continued to boom. The Whig Party, seriously divided, was unable to mount much of a challenge, and 2 of its best-known leaders, Webster and Clay, died in 1852. Pierce intended to maintain the unity of his party by supporting expansionist policies. Southerners hoped that U.S. expansion into Central America and or Cuba would lead to the expansion of slavery. The Gadsden Purchase. In 1853, Pierce gave James Gadsden, a diplomat and railway entrepreneur, the authority to negotiate the purchase of 250,000 square miles of Mexican territory. Gadsden eventually agreed to purchase 54,000 square miles. This proved controversial. Southerners supported the acquisition of this territory, not because of its slavery potential, but because it would assist in the building of a southern railroad to the Pacific. Gadsden Treaty gained Senate approval only after a Northern Amendment slashed 9,000 square miles from the proposal purchase. Cuba. Pierce was known to acquire Cuba, still ruled by Spain. Initially, he supported a major southern expedition to the island. However, Northern viewed this suggestion as another example of Southern efforts to expand slavery. Alarmed by Northern opposition, Pierce abandoned his support for the expedition. Still hoping to obtain Cuba, Pierce authorized Pere Sol, the U.S. minister in Spain, to offer up to 130 million for the island. Events, however, soon slipped out of Pierce's control. In October 1854, the U.S. ministers to Britain, France, and Spain met in Belgium and issued the Olmsted Manifesto. This stated that if Spain refused to sell the island, the USA would be justified in taking it. Details of the Olmsted Manifesto were leaked and immediately denounced by Northerners. Pierce said that he did not support the manifesto, and Solou resigned. The unsuccessful expansion efforts angered Northerners who believed that the South aspired to establish a Latin American slave empire. The problem of Kansas-Nebraska. Nebraska, part of the Louisiana Purchase, was still unsettled in the early 1850s. Until Congress organized the area into a treaty, land could not be surveyed and put up for sale. While Northerners were keen to see Nebraska developed, Southerners were less enthusiastic. Nebraska lay north of latitude 3630, and by the terms of the Missouri Compromise, new states in the area would enter the Union as free states. Douglas's motives. In January 1854, Senator Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Bill into Congress. Douglas, a man of energy and presidential ambition, had pushed unsuccessfully for Nebraska to become a territory since 1844. In order to get a Nebraska bill enacted, he knew he needed the support of some of the Southern senators. A number, including Senator Archishon of Missouri, agreed to support Douglas if his bill specifically repealed the Missouri Compromise, divided the Nebraskan territory into two, Kansas in the south and Nebraska in the north. There was little chance of slavery taking hold in Nebraska. The climate was too cold for plantation agriculture, but it was possible that it might spread to Kansas. Douglas, a supporter of popular sovereignty, accepted the Southern demands. He was confident that the people of Kansas and Nebraska would not vote for slavery. He believed that Kansas-Nebraska measure would enhance his reputation nationally and allow him in Illinois, where many people, not least himself, stood to benefit financially from a transcontinental railway running west from Chicago. A hell of a storm. Douglas's bill created, in his own words, a hell of a storm. It was proof to the many Northerners that the slave power conspiracy was still at work. The ferocity of Northern criticisms of Douglas' measure led to a Southern counterattack. Passage of the bill suddenly became the symbol of Southern honor. The result was a great congressional struggle. The Northern Democrats and Whigs joined forces in opposing the measure. Southern Whigs and Democrats united in supporting it. After months of bitter debate, the bill passed both houses of Congress, becoming law in May of 1854. While 90% of Southerners voted for it, 84% of Northerners voted against it. 64% of Northerners voted against it. By failing to predict the extent of Northern outrage, Douglas had weakened his party, damaged his own presidential ambitions, and helped to revive North-South rivalry. Changes in the party political system, the decline of the Whigs, and the rise of the Republican Party. From the 1830s to the early 1850s, the Democrats and Whigs drew upon national, not sectional, support. As long as voters placed loyalty to party ahead of sectional loyalty, neither North nor South could easily be united, one against the other. But in early 1850, the second party system collapsed. The 1854 midterm elections. In the 1854 midterm elections, the Democrats, apparently blamed for sponsoring the Kansas-Nebraska Act, lost all but 23 of their previously 91 free state seats in Congress. Before 1854, the Whigs would have benefited by 1854. However, the Whig Party was no longer a major force in many free states. The Whig collapse had little to do with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It had far more to do with another issue: immigration. Catholic immigrants. Between 1845 and 1854, some 3 million immigrants entered the USA. Over 1 million of these were Irish Catholics. German Catholics also made up a considerable number of immigrants. Fear of a plot by the Catholic Church to subvert the USA was deep-rooted among native-born Americans, most of whom were strongly Protestant. Many were horrified by the growth of Catholicism between 1850 and 1854. The number of Catholic bishops, priests, and churches almost doubled. native-born Americans resented the growing political power of Catholic voters, claiming that the Irish voted as their political bosses or their priests told them. This was seen as a threat to democracy. Mass immigration also had serious social and economic consequences. Irish immigration provided a source of cheap labor, pulling down wage levels. They were also associated with the increasing crime and welfare costs. Given that most Irish and Germans voted Democrat, that party was unlikely to support anti-immigrant measures. The Whigs also failed to respond to nativist concerns. Indeed, in the 1852 elections, some Whig leaders made efforts to win the immigrant vote. Frustrated Northerners began to look to new parties to represent their views.
The Know Nothings. As concern about immigration and Catholicism grew, the Know Nothings movement increased in strength. The Know Nothings pledged to vote for no one except native-born presidents. When asked questions, they were supposed to have replied, "I know nothing," thereby giving the movement its name. The Know Nothing Order movement first entered politics by throwing its support behind suitable candidates from the existing parties. It had so much success that it soon became a political party in its own right. Most Know-Nothings wanted checks on immigration and a 21-year probationary period before immigrants could become full American citizens. But Northerners joined the movement for a variety of reasons. Most supported its anti-Catholic stance. Some approved the fact it promised to return power to the people. The unpopularity of the Kansas-Nebraska Act associated with the Democrats helped the Know-Nothings. So many Whigs joined the Know-Nothing Party order that leading Democrats initially thought it was an arm of the Whig Party. They soon discovered that their own supporters were also streaming into the movement. In 1854 to 55, it won control of several northern states. It also won large-scale support, mainly from ex-Whigs in the South. By 1855, the order called itself the American Party, the Republican Party. Northerners were not just concerned with anti-immigrant issues. The Kansas-Nebraska Act awakened the threat of the slave power, and many Northerners were keen to give support to parties opposed to slavery expansion. In 1854, several anti-slavery coalitions were formed under various names. The Republican Party name finally caught on. By 1854 to 1855, it was not clear whether the Know-Nothings or Republicans would replace the Whigs as the Democrats' main rival in the North. In most free states, the two parties were not necessarily in competition. Indeed, they often tried to avoid a contest in order to defeat the Democrats. Many Northerners hated both Catholicism and slave power. Given the Democrat reverses in the North in 1854, it was clear that there would be an anti-Democrat majority in the 1855 to 1856 Congress. Whether the anti-Democrat congressmen were more concerned with limiting immigration or preventing the expansion of slavery remained to be seen. At this stage, many Republicans were know-nothings and vice versa. For those pure Republicans who were opposed to nativism, the 1854 elections were a major setback. Indeed, most political observers expected the Know-Nothings to be the main opponent to the Democrats in 1856. The Republican Party could never be more than a Northern party. In contrast, the Know-Nothings drew support from both North and South. The issue of Kansas, 1854 to 1856. After 1854, settlers began to move into Kansas. Their main concern was land and water rights. However, for politicians, far more was at stake. Northerners thought that if slavery expanded into Kansas, it might expand anywhere. Southerners feared that a free state would be another nail in the slavery coffin. Senator Seward of New York declared, "We will engage in competition for the virgin soil of Kansas, and God give the victory to the side which is stronger in numbers as it is in right." Senator of Missouri took up the challenge. "We are playing for a mighty stake. If we win, we carry slavery to the Pacific Ocean. If we fail, we lose Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas, and all political territories. The game must be played boldly." Northerners and Southerners tried to influence events in Kansas. The Massachusetts Emigrant Aid Company sponsored over 1,500 Northerners to settle in Kansas in 1854 to 1855. The senator of Missouri formed the Platte County Defensive Association, which was pledged to ensure that Kansas became a slave state. Elections in Kansas. In March 1855, Kansas elected its first territorial legislature. Hundreds of pro-slavery Missourians crossed into Kansas to vote and then returned home. This ensured that the legislation, which met at Lecompton, was dominated by pro-slavers. It proceeded to pass a series of pro-slavery laws. Free state or free soil settlers in Kansas denied the validity of the pro-slavery legislature and set up their own government at Topeka. The free staters were divided, especially between moderates and fanatics. While the fanatics held abolitionist views, the moderates were not dissimilar to the pro-slavers. Most were openly racist. One of the main reasons they opposed slavery was that it would result in an influx of blacks. The Topeka government, dominated by moderates, banned blacks, slave or free, from Kansas. Bleeding Kansas. In May 1856, a pro-slavery posse trying to arrest Free State leaders sacked and burned some buildings in Lawrence, a Free State center. This event, blown up out of all proportion by Northern journalists, sparked off more serious violence. At Porch Something Creek, John Brown, a fervent abolitionist, and several of his sons murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers. Northern newspapers suppressing the facts, claimed that Brown had acted in self-defense. Overnight, he became a Northern war hero. In Kansas, his actions led to a series of tit-for-tat killings. The Northern press again exaggerated the situation, describing it as civil war, with events seemingly drifting out of control. Pierce appointed a new governor, John Geary, who managed to patch up a truce between the warring factions. Nevertheless, events in Kansas and the distorted reporting of them helped to boost Republican fortunes. Bleeding Kansas became a rallying cry for Northerners opposed to what they perceived to be the slave power at work. American Party problems. The American Party, the Know-Nothing Party, had success in both northern and southern states in 1855. Ironically, success in the South was to be a major reason for the American Party's undoing. The Know-Nothings had won massive northern support in 1854 to 1855 because they had been able to exploit anti-slavery and nativist issues. However, the American Party, to retain Southern support, had to drop the anti-Kansas-Nebraska position. By doing so, it lost Northern support. Only factions also demanded the party. Other factors also damaged the party. The decline of immigration in the mid-1850s resulted in a decline of nativism. The failure of legislatures dominated the know-nothings to make good their campaign promises enabled critics to claim that the movement did nothing. Events in Congress, which met in December 1855, also weakened the American Party. The Nebraska nativists split North and South after a great struggle. Nathaniel Banks, an ex-Know-Nothing who was now a Republican, eventually became Speaker of the House. The speakership consent helped to weld the Republicans into a more coherent party. Republican policies. The Republican Party included abolitionists and those who had previously been Whigs, Democrats, or Know-Nothings. Unsurprisingly, historians have different opinions about what the party stood for and why Northerners supported it. It is easy to say that Republicans were against what than they were for. Obviously, they were against the Democrat Party. They were also opposed to slave power, which was seen as conspiring against Northern interests. However, Republican leaders were not consistent in defending who was conspiring. Was it all or just some planters? All slaveholders or all Southerners? Republicans also had different views about the nature of the conspiracy. Many were convinced it sought to be re-establish slavery in the North. Such fears were grossly exaggerated. Nevertheless, the idea of a slave power conspiracy was an article of faith for virtually all Republicans. However, while almost all Republicans were opposed to slavery's expansion, few supported immediate abolishment or believed in black equality. Many viewed this with horror, the prospect of thousands of freed slaves pouring northwards. Bleeding Summer. An event in Congress in May 1856 possibly helped Republican fortunes more than the situation in Kansas. Following a speech in which Senator Sumner attacked Southern Senator Butler, Congressman Preston Brooks entered the Senate, found Sumner at his desk, and proceeded to beat him, shattering his cane in the process. Bleeding Sumner outraged Northerners as much as Bleeding Kansas. Here was more evidence of slave power at work, using brute force to silence free speech. While Sumner became a Northern martyr, Brooks became a Southern hero. Resigning from Congress, Brooks stood for re-election and won easily. Southerners sent him new canes to replace the one he had broken. The 1856 presidential election. The American Party held its national convention in February 1856. After a call to repeal the Kansas-Nebraska Act was defeated, the many Northerners delegates left the organization. The American Party went on to select ex-President Fillmore as its presidential candidate. Fillmore, more an old-fashioned Whig than a know-nothing, had pro-Southerner sympathies. He thus had limited appeal in the North. Republican leaders decided that 43-year-old John C. Fremont would be the party's best presidential candidate. Born in the South, Fremont had a colorful career as a Western explorer. Many saw him, wrongly, as the conqueror of California in 1846. An ex-know-nothing, he had been a Democrat senator for California for just 17 days. He was thus a strange choice for a Republican candidate, but the romance surrounding Fremont's career was likely to make him popular. The Republican platform was radical. Congress, it declared, had both the right and the imperative duty to prohibit in the territories those twin realities of bardism, polygamy, and slavery.
polygamy and slavery. The polygamy reference was a popular attack on Mormon practices in Utah. The Republican slogan was clear: free soil, free labor, free men, Vermont. The Democrats nominated James Bunchman. He had spent 4 decades in public service as a Northerner. He was nevertheless acceptable to the South, given that he came from Pennsylvania, regarded as a crucial state to win. He was probably the Democrats' strongest candidate. The Democrat platform endorsed popular sovereignty in the North. The contest was essentially between Bruchman and Vermont. In the South, it was between Bruchman and Fillmore. For the first time since 1849 to 1850, there was widespread fear that the Union's safety if Vermont won. It was conceivable that many Southern states would secede. In November, Fillmore obtained 21.6% of the popular vote and 8 electoral college votes. Vermont won 33.1% of the total vote, 45% of the northern vote, but virtually no southern votes. He won 114 electoral votes. Bruchman, with 45.3% of the popular vote and 174 electoral votes, became president. He won all but one southern state, plus Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Indiana, Illinois, and California. The Democrats had cause for celebration. They had seen off the Fillmore challenge in the South and retained their traditional supporters in the North. The Republicans, however, also had cause for optimism. If the Republican Party had carried Pennsylvania and Illinois, Fremont would have become president. Republican leaders, confident that they could win over the remaining anti-Democrat groups in the North, were soon predicting victory in 1860. Nevertheless, there was no guarantee that Northerners would continue to vote Republican. The party might collapse as quickly as it had risen. The significance of states' rights. State rights refers to the struggle between the federal government and the individual states over political power. By the 1850s, most Southerners supported the principle of states' rights, the view that most issues should be decided at state rather than federal level. They could claim that the 10th Amendment to the Constitution stated that any right not explicitly granted to the federal government in the Constitution should be given to the states. Some Southerners accepted Calhoun's view that individual states had the right to nullify any federal law with which they disagreed. In reality, however, there was only one state right that really concerned Southerners. This was the right to maintain the institution of slavery. By the 1850s, most Southerners believed that the North, with its much larger population, was set on the abolishment of slavery. The rise of the Republican Party seemed evidence of Northerners' intent. Southerners feared that a Republican-dominated federal government would infringe their states' rights, particularly with regard to slavery. In some respects, Southerners were correct in their assumptions. Some radical abolitionists in the North were determined to abolish slavery, even if this meant abolishing the Constitution at the same time. The radical abolitionists were a small minority in the North. The Republican Party was committed to stopping the expansion of slavery. It was not committed to abolishing slavery or tearing up the Constitution. The Constitution clearly allowed individual states the rights to maintain slavery. It was, of course, possible to amend the Constitution. To do so, both houses of Congress have to support the proposed amendment with a 2/3 majority. 3/4 of the individual states then have to back the proposed amendment. In short, it is difficult to see how a proposal to add a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery could have been passed, there were 15 slave states. If they continued to support slavery, 45 free states would have been required to change the Constitution. That is 60 states in total. Even today, there are only 50 states in the USA. Slavery in the southern states was thus no immediate threat. But this was not how Southerners saw things. Many viewed the prospect of Republican success in 1860 with alarm. If that were to happen, there were some Southerners who believed that individual states had the right to secede from the Union. Summary. Slavery, especially the issue of its expansion, continued to divide Southerners from the Northerners in the period of 1850 to 1856. The most serious crisis came in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. The Democrat Party and most Southerners were committed to popular sovereignty, the notion that people and territories should be able to decide whether their new states were slave or free. Pro-slavery supporters and free states fought for control of Kansas, convinced that a slave power conspiracy was at work. Many Northerners came to support the Republican Party, which was pledged to stop slavery expanding. The 1856 presidential election was won by the Democrat candidate James Buchanan. His victory prevented a crisis that would undoubtedly have occurred if the Republican Fremont had been elected. 1.3. Why did the Republicans win the 1860 presidential election? At the start of 1857, many Americans were optimistic about the future. Buchanan's victory had prevented a major division. If the problem of Kansas could be solved, then sectional tension was likely to ease. No other territory was likely to be so contentious. The emerging notion of slave power. Buchanan's position seemed strong in 1857. Both houses of Congress and the Supreme Court were dominated by Democrats. However, by the end of 1857, the historian Kenneth Stamp, 1919, claimed that North and South had reached the political point of no return. According to Stamp, the events of 1857 prevented a peaceful resolution to sectional strife. Buchanan and Stamp's view must shoulder much of the blame, pursuing policies which pushed most Northerners into the Republican camp. Ideological attached to the South and aware that he needed Southern support to ensure a majority in Congress. Buchanan chose a pro-Southern cabinet from the start. Many Northerners feared that he was a tool of the slave power. His actions soon confirmed this fear. The Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave who had accompanied his master, an army surgeon, first to Illinois, then to Wisconsin Territory, before returning to Missouri. In the 1840s, with the help of anti-slavery lawyers, Scott went before the Missouri courts, claiming he was free on the grounds that he had resided in a free state and in a free territory. The Scott case, long and drawn out, eventually reached the Supreme Court. By March 1857, the court, composed of 5 Southerners and 4 Northerners, was ready to pass judgment. Buchanan referred to the case in his inaugural address, claiming not quite truthfully that he knew nothing of the court's decision. He said he was ready to cheerfully submit to its verdict and urged all good citizens to do likewise. 2 days later, the Supreme Court's decision was made public. Led by pro-Southerner Chief Justice Roger Taney, the court decided that Scott could not sue for his freedom. Black Americans, whether slave or free, did not have the same rights as white citizens. Scott's stay in Illinois did not make him free. Scott's stay in Wisconsin made no difference. The 1820 Missouri Compromise ban on slavery in territories north of 36 through 30 was illegal. All U.S. citizens had the right to take their property into the territories. Northern reaction. To Northerners, the Dred Scott decision seemed further proof of the slave power at work. Republicans claimed that the whispered conversation between Taney and Bridgman on Inauguration Day proved that the president had been aware of the court's decision when he asked Americans to accept it. Northerners' papers launched a fierce onslaught on the Supreme Court, and some editors talked of defying the law. However, the judgment was easier to denounce than defy. In part, it simply annulled a law which had already been repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The court's decision even had little effect on Scott, as thanks to Northern sympathizers, he soon purchased his freedom. Nevertheless, the verdict was important. Rather than settling the uncertainty about slavery in the territories, the decision provoked further sectional antagonism. It was seen by some Northerners as an attempt to outlaw the Republican Party, which was committed to slavery's exclusion from the territories. Increasing confrontation within and between North and South. The Dred Scott case and the 1857 economic depression angered Northerners. Many regarded Bridgman as a Southern puppet. Events in Kansas in 1857 to 1858 confirmed their fears. Problems in Kansas. In Kansas, Bridgman faced a situation which offered some hope. Although there were still two governments, the official pro-slave one at Lebanon and the unofficial free state one at Topeka, Governor Greary had restored order in the territory. It was obvious to Greary and to other observers that free staters now had a majority in Kansas. Given his declared commitment to popular sovereignty, all that Bridgman needed to do was ensure that the majority will prevail. A fair situation of the Kansas problem would deprive the Republicans of one of their most effective issues. In March 1857, Bridgman appointed Robert Walker, an experienced Southern politician, as governor of Kansas. Walker was committed to fair elections in Kansas. His first task was to convince free staters to take part in the June election for a convention to draw up a constitution that would set the territory on the road to statehood. Suspecting that any election organized by the pro-slavers would be rigged, free staters refused to get involved. Pro-slavers thus won all the convention seats. The pro-slavers' success, while making a mockery of popular sovereignty, raised the expectations of Southerners who realized that the creation of a new slave state was now a real possibility. Meanwhile, the election for a new territorial legislature in Kansas was held in October. Walker convinced free staters that they should participate, assuring them that he would do all he could to see that the election was fairly conducted. Attempts by the pro-slavers to fix the election failed. Walker overturned enough fraudulent results to give the free staters a majority in the legislature. The Lebanon Constitution. The Lecompton Constitutional Convention now drafted a pro-slavery constitution, while agreeing to allow a referendum on its proposals. It offered voters something of a superfluous choice. They had to accept that pro-slavery constitution as it was. They could accept another constitution which banned the future importation of slaves but guaranteed the rights of slaveholders already in Kansas. Walker denounced the convention's actions as a vile fraud, but Bridgman supported the Lebanon convention rather than Walker, and in December Walker resigned. That same month, Kansas voted on the Lexicon Constitution. In fact, most free staters abstained in protest. The pro-slave returns showed a large majority for the Constitution. Bridgman endorsed the actions of the Lexicon Convention, claiming that the question of slavery had been fairly and explicitly referred to the people. Benjamin versus Douglas. By accepting the Constitution, Bridgman gave Republicans massive political ammunition. More importantly, he enraged Northern Democrats like Douglas, who were committed to popular sovereignty. In an impassioned speech to the Senate, Douglas attacked both Bridgman and the Constitution. Southern Democrats immediately denounced Douglas. The Democratic Party, like almost every other American institute, was now split on northern/southern lines. A major congressional contest followed, with Douglas siding with the Republicans. Using all the powers of patronage at his disposal, Bridgman tried to ensure that Northern Democrats voted for the Lexicon Constitution. The Senate passed the measure, but enough Northern Democrats in the House of Representatives opposed the president, ensuring that the Lexicon Constitution was defeated. Bridgman accepted that Kansas should vote again on the issue. The vote in August 1858 resulted in a free state victory. 11,300 votes voted against the Constitution, and only 1,788 people voted for it. Kansas now set about drawing up a new constitution and finally joined the Union in 1861 as a free state. The 1858 congressional elections. The 1858 midterm elections came at a bad time for Northern Democrats, with the party split between those who supported Bridgman and those who supported Douglas. Given that Douglas had to stand for re-election, national attention focused on the Illinois campaign. The fourth largest state, its voters might determine the outcome of the 1860 presidential election. The Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln to run against Douglas. Abraham Lincoln, born in a log cabin, Lincoln had little formal schooling. A loyal Whig, he was elected to the House of Representatives in 1846. Defeated in 1848, he returned to Illinois and resumed his successful law practice. The Kansas-Nebraska Act brought him back into politics. Previously, his main concern had been economic matters. Now his speeches became more anti-slave power. Although he had not much of a national reputation in 1858, he was well known in Illinois. Douglas commented, "He is the strong man of the party, full of wit, facts, dates, and the best stump speaker, with his droll ways and dry jokes in the West. He is as honest as he is shrewd." The Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas agreed to meet Lincoln for 7 open-air debates. These debates, from August to October 1858, drew vast crowds. Both men were gifted speakers. The debates were confined almost excessively to 3 topics: race, slavery, and slavery expansion. By today's standards, Lincoln and Douglas do not seem far apart. This is perhaps not surprising. Both men were moderates as far as their parties were concerned, and both were fighting for the middle ground. Both considered blacks to be inferior to whites. Lincoln declared, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the whites and black races." However, the two did differ in one key way. Douglas never once said in public that slavery was a moral evil. Lincoln may not have believed in racial equality, but he did believe that blacks and whites shared a common humanity. If slavery is not wrong, he said, then nothing is wrong. The Illinois result. Lincoln won some 125,000 popular votes to Douglas 121,000. However, Douglas supporters kept control of the Illinois legislature, which re-elected Douglas as senator. This was a significant triumph for Douglas, solidifying his leadership of the Northern Democrats. However, during the debates with Lincoln, Douglas had said much that angered Southerners, not least his stressing of the Freeport Doctrine. Although Lincoln had lost, at least he had emerged from the election with his reputation boosted. Generally, the 1858 elections were a disaster for the Northern Democrats. The Republicans won control of the House of Representatives, their share of the vote in the crucial states of Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, and New Jersey, rising from 35% in 1856 to 52%. If the voting pattern was repeated in 1860, the Republicans would win the presidency. The growing strength of abolitionism. Most Southerners regarded the Republican Party as an abolitionist party. Republican success in the midterm elections in 1858 seemed proof that the abolitionists were growing in power in the North. Other events in 1859 strengthened this fear. John Brown's raid. John Brown had become famous or infamous for his violent acts in Kansas. Now in his late 50s, Brown wished to do something decisive for the anti-slavery cause. The fact that he was able to win financial support from hard-headed Northern businessmen is testimony to both his forceful personality and the intensity of abolitionist sentiment in 1859. Brown determined to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, seize weapons, retreat to the Appalachian Mountains, and spark a slave revolt. On October 16, 1859, Brown and 18 men succeeded in capturing the arsenal and a number of hostages. But rather than escape, Brown remained in Harper's Ferry. Virginia and Maryland state militia units and a detachment of troops led by Colonel Robert E. Lee converged on the town. A 36-hour siege on the fire engine house in which Brown had taken refuge followed. On October 18th, Lee ordered the fire engine house to be stormed. In the ensuing struggle, Brown was captured along with 6 of his men. 10 of his army were killed. 7 other people also died. The results of Brown's raid. Brown, found guilty of treason, was executed in December 1859. Most Southerners were appalled at what happened. Their worst fears had been realized. An abolitionist had tried to stir up a slave revolt. They suspected that most Northerners sympathized with his action. While some Northerners did see Brown as a hero, many did not approve of his actions, and leading Republicans criticized the raid. Few Southerners were reassured. Most saw Republicans and abolitionists like Brown as one and the same. Sectional tensions 1859 to 1860. Over the winter of 1859 to 1860, there were rumors of slave insurrection in many southern states. Local vigilante committees were set up and slave patrols strengthened. Southern state governments purchased additional weapons, and Southern militia units drilled rather more than previously. When Congress met in December 1859, both houses divided along sectional lines. Southerners opposed all Republican measures, free homesteads, higher tariffs, and Pacific Railroad. Northerners blocked all pro-Southern proposals. By 1860, Northern and Southern politicians attacked each other in passionate speeches. Northerners feared a conspiracy by the slave power. Southerners feared the growing strength of the black Republicans. Far from easing tension, Bridgman's policies had helped to widen the sectional rift. His presidency must thus be regarded as one of the great failures of leadership in the U.S. history. The election campaign of 1860 and the divisions of the Democratic Party. The prospect of a Republican electoral triumph in 1860 filled Southerners with outrage. It was not merely that a Republican victory might threaten slavery. Most fundamentally, Southerners believed that the North was treating the South as its inferior. Submission to the Republicans, declared Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, would be intolerable to a proud people. The stakes of the 1860 election, therefore, were alarmingly high. Democrat Party divisions. In 1858, the Democrat Party had split over the issue of Kansas. Many Northern Democrats had supported Senator Douglas stand against President Bridgman. Southern Democrats, who had remained loyal to Bridgman, were highly critical of Douglas. Douglas, determined to run for president in 1860, tried to build bridges in the South in 1859 to 1860. Rationally, he was the South's best hope. He was the only Democrat who was likely to carry some free states. But Douglas' stand against the Constitution alienated him from many Southerners. The Democratic Convention. Events at the Democratic Convention, which met in April 1860 at Charleston, showed that the party, never mind the country, was a horse divided against itself. Although Douglas had the support of most of the delegates, he failed to win the two-thirds majority which Democrat candidates were expected to achieve. After 57 ballots, the Democratic Convention agreed to reconvene at Baltimore in June. When some Southern delegates who had left Charleston Convention tried to take their seats at Baltimore, the convention, dominated by Douglas supporters, preferred to take pro-Douglas delegates. This led to a mass Southern walkout. With so many Southern delegates gone, Douglas easily won the convention's nomination. Douglas X. Breckinridge. Southern delegates now set up their own convention and nominated current Vice President John Breckinridge on a platform that called for the federal government to protest slavery in the territories. Although John was supported by Cass, Pierce, and Bridgman, the last three Democratic presidential candidates who were all Northerners, it was clear that the Democratic Party had split along sectional lines between North and South. The split is often seen as ensuring Republican success. However, the fact that Douglas could now campaign in the North without having to try to maintain a united Democrat Party probably helped his case. The Republican Convention. The Republican Convention met in May at Chicago. Its platform called for higher protective tariffs, free 160-acre homesteads, plots of lands for Western settlers, a northern transcontinental railway. While opposed to any extension of slavery, the platform specifically promised that the party had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed, and it condemned John Brown's raid as the gravest of crimes. Lincoln becomes the Republican candidate. William Seward, governor of New York, was favorite to win the Republican presidential nomination. But the fact that he had been a major figure in public life for so long meant that he had many enemies. Although there were a number of other political candidates, Seward's main opponent turned out to be Lincoln. Lincoln had several things in his favor. He came from the key state of Illinois. He had gained a national reputation as a result of his debates with Douglas in 1858. He had made dozens of speeches across the North in 1859 to 1860, making himself known. Given that it was difficult to attach an ideological label to him, he was able to appear to be all things to all men. His lack of administrative experience helped his reputation for honesty and integrity. Lincoln's ambitions were helped by the convention being held at Chicago in his home state of Illinois. His campaign managers were able to pack the convention hall with his supporters. On the first ballot, Seward won most votes, but not enough for victory. As other candidates dropped out, most of their votes went to Lincoln. By the third ballot, there was an irresistible momentum in Lincoln's favor. Lincoln's campaign managers almost certainly made secret deals with delegates from Pennsylvania and Indiana, probably to the effect that Lincoln would appoint Simon Carman from Pennsylvania and Caleb Smith from Indiana to his cabinet. These deals helped Lincoln and win the Republican nomination. The Constitutional Unionist Party. A new party, the Constitutional Unionists, composed mainly of ex-Southern Whigs, nominated John Bell of Tennessee as presidential candidate. Its platform was the shortest in the U.S. political history. The Constitution of the country, the Union of the states, and the enforcement of the laws of the United States. The party essentially wanted to maintain the Union and was opposed to extreme views both in North and South. It denounced the Republicans as abolitionist fanatics and John's Democrats as wanting to break the Union. The campaign. In the North, the main fight was between Lincoln and Douglas. Bell and Breckinridge fought it out in the South. Douglas was the only candidate who actively involved himself in the campaign. At some personal risk, he campaigned in the South, warning Southerners of the dangerous consequences of secession. Throughout the campaign, Lincoln remained in Springfield, conferring with Republican chiefs but saying nothing. Perhaps he should have made some effort to reassure Southerners that he was not a major threat to their section. However, he could hardly go out of his way to appease the South. This would have harmed his cause in the North. Moreover, it is difficult to see what he could have said to allay Southern fears, given that the very existence of the party was offensive to Southerners. Although Lincoln, Bell, and Breckinridge kept silent, this did not prevent their supporters campaigning for them. Republican propaganda concentrated on the slave power conspiracy. Southern Democrats stereotyped all Northerners as abolitionists. In some states, the three anti-Republican parties tried to unite, but these efforts were too little and too late. The bitter feuds that existed between the supporters of Breckinridge, Douglas, and Bell prevented compromise. The election results. In November, Bell won 593,000 votes, carrying the states of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Breckinridge, with 843,000 votes, won 11 of the 15 slave states. Douglas obtained 1,383,000 votes but won only 2 states, Missouri and New Jersey. Lincoln won 1,866,000 votes, 40% of the total votes. Although he got no votes at all in 10 southern states, he won 54% of the northern votes and, except for New Jersey, carried all the free states. With a majority of 180 to 123 in the Electoral College, he became president, even if the opposition had combined against him in every free state. Lincoln would still have triumphed because he won a majority of votes in virtually every northern state. Why did Northerners vote Republican? Northerners voted for Lincoln because he seemed to represent their section. A vote for Lincoln was a vote against the slave power, while not wishing to get rid of slavery. Immediately, most Northerners had no wish to see it expanded. Slavery and the slave power, however, were not Northerners' only concerns. Nativism had not disappeared with the demise of the Know-Nothings. Although the Republicans took an ambiguous stand on the nativist issues, anti-Catholic Northerners had little opinion but to vote Republican, if only because the Democrat Party remained the home of Irish and German Catholics. Many Northerners approved of Republican economic proposals. The corruption issue was also important. In 1860, a House investigative committee dominated by Republicans had found corruption at every level of Richmond's government. They had tarnished the Democrat Party. Summary. Relations between Northerners and Southerners worsened between 1857 and 1860. Southerners feared that they perceived to be the growing strength of abolitionism. Represented by the Republican Party, Northerners continued to see the slave power conspiracy at work and believed President Richmond was a puppet of the South. The situation in Kansas and John Brown's raid served to increase tensions. By 1860, the Democrat Party, like most others, organizations had split. Northerners supported Douglas, while Southerners supported Breckinridge. Abraham Lincoln, who had built up his reputation following his debuts with Douglas in the midterm election in Illinois in 1858, won the Republican nomination, winning the support of virtually all the free states. He was elected president in 1860. 1.4 Why did the Civil War begin in April 1861? Few Americans expected war in the days following Lincoln's presidential election triumph. It was evident that most Southerners were outraged that a Northern anti-slavery party had captured the presidency, but this in itself did not necessarily mean war. Yet it soon became evident that the USA faced a terrible crisis, a crisis which ultimately led to civil war, the result of the 1860 presidential election. Rationally, there were excellent reasons why the Southern states should not secede from the Union. Lincoln had promised he would not interfere with slavery in those states where it existed. Even if Lincoln harbored secret ambitions to abolish slavery, there was little he could do. His party did not control Congress or the Supreme Court, and presidential power was strictly limited by the Constitution. Secession would mean abandoning an enforceable Fugitive Slave Act. Secession might lead to civil war, which would threaten slavery far more than Lincoln's election. Southern fears. Few Southerners regarded things so calmly. A Northern anti-slavery party with no pretense of support in the South had captured the presidency. Lincoln was depicted as an abolitionist who would encourage slave insurrections. He would certainly stop slavery's expansion. Southerners feared that it would be encircled by a swelling majority of free states and that ultimately slavery would be voted out of existence. Southerners saw themselves as aggrieved innocence in an unequal struggle that unleashed more and more northern aggression on southern rights. Honor demanded that a stand be taken against the latest outrage, the election of Lincoln. Across the South, there was a strange mixture of moods: hysteria, despair, and elation. Fire eaters who had agitated for years for Southern independence capitalized on the mood. Long on the fringe of Southern politics, they now found themselves supported by mainstream politicians. Palms for the secession. Southerners were far from united. There were still much Unionist sympathy in the South, nor was there agreement on the best political strategy to adopt. While some believed that Lincoln's election was grounds enough for secession, others thought it was best to wait took until he took hostile action against the South. Immediate secessionists knew that if they forced the issue, they might destroy the unity they were seeking to create. But if they waited for unity, they might never act. How to force the issue was another problem. If individual states acted alone, there was the danger that they would receive no support from other states, as South Carolina had found in the 1832 nullification crisis. Yet trying to organize a mass move for secession might ensure nothing happened, as in 1849 to 1850. Secession of the seven deep South states. Events moved quicker than most people expected. South Carolina succeeds. On November 10th, 1860, South Carolina's state legislature called for elections to a special convention to meet on December 17th to decide whether the state would secede. This move created a chain reaction. Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and Florida all put similar convention procedures underway. In Texas, Governor Sam Houston, who opposed disunion, delayed proceedings, but only by a few weeks. Individual states committed themselves initially to individual actions. However, it was clear that many Southerners were equally committed to joint actions. When Congress met in early December 30th, 30 representatives from 9 southern states declared, "We are satisfied the honor, safety, and independence of the southern people are to be found only in Southern Confederacy, a result to be obtained only by separate state secession." Separate state secession was not long in coming. On December 20th, the South Carolina Convention voted 169 to 0 for secession. South Carolina sent commissioners to other southern states to propose a meeting. The Montgomery, Alabama, on February 4th, 1861, to create a new southern government. Secession spreads. Over the winter of 1860, 61 to 61, the election of delegates for conventions that would decide on secession took place in 6 other lower southern states. Voters generally had a choice between immediate secessionists and cooperationists. While the standpoint of the immediate secessionists was clear, the cooperationists represented a wide spectrum of opinion. Some were secessionists but believed that the time was not yet right to secede. Others were Unionists opposed to secession. In Missouri, there was 12,000 votes for candidates whose views remain unknown. 12,218 votes for cooperationist candidates, 16,800 votes for immediate secession on January 9th, 1861. The Missouri Convention supported secession by 85 votes to 15. On January 10th, the Florida Convention voted 62-7 for secession, but cooperationists won over 35% of the votes. Alabama voted to secede by 61 votes to 39 on January 11th. The secessions won 35,600 votes. Cooperationists 28,100. Secessionists in Georgia won 44,152 votes. Cooperationists 41,632. The Georgia Conference wanted to secede on January 19th by 2008 by 208 voters to 89. In Louisiana, secession won 20,214 votes. The cooperationists 18,451. On January 26th, the Louisiana Convention voted to secede by 113 votes to 17. On February 1st, the Texas Convention voted for secession by 166 votes to 8. Texas then had a referendum to ratify the convention's action. Secession was approved by 44,317 votes to 13,020 votes. A slave power conspiracy? Republicans, including Lincoln, saw events in the South as a continuation of the slave power conspiracy. They claimed that a few planters had conned the elaborate into voting for secession, to which most Southerners were not really committed. The debate about whether secession was led by a small aristocratic clique or was a genuine democratic act has continued. Slaveholders certainly dominated politics in many lower South states. Secession sentiment was strongest whenever the percentage of slaves was highest. Areas with few slaves, by contrast, tended to vote against disunionization, according to historian David Potter, 1976, to a much greater degree than the slaveholders' desired. Secession had become a slave owners' movement. Potter believed that a secessionist minority with a clear purpose and at a time of intense excitement were able to win mass support. However, Potter concealed that the secessionists acted democratically and in an open and straightforward manner. By no means all secessionists were great planters, nor did all great planters support secession. Many non-slaveholders supported secession, while secessionists opposed efforts by co-operationists to submit secession ordinances to a popular referendum. This would probably have been superfluous. The Southern Electorate had made its position clear. There was no conspiracy to thwart the will of the majority. The aims of Lincoln and Davis. For Americans expected war in early 1861, most Northerners believed that the seceded states were bluffing, or thought that an extreme minority had seized power against the wishes of the majority. Either way, the seceded states would soon be back in the Union. The Southern bluff would be called, or the Unionist majority would assert itself. In contrast, most Southerners thought that the North would not fight to preserve the Union. Border states, Americans were confident that a compromise could be arranged with would bring the seceded states back into the Union. These hopes and expectations were not to be realized. Was this the fault of blundering politicians, not least Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis? The Confederacy. On February 4th, 1861, 50 delegates of the seceded states met at Montgomery to launch the Confederate government, chosen by the secessionist conventions. Most of the delegates were lawyers or planters. 49 were slave owners and 21 owned at least 20 slaves. 60% were former Democrats, 40% were former Whigs. All in all, they comprised a broad cross-section of the South's traditional political leadership. Almost half the delegates were so co-operationists. The convention, desperate to win the support of the Upper South, tried to project a moderate, united image. On February 9th, it set up a committee to draft a permanent constitution. This was approved in March and quickly ratified, closely modeled on the U.S. Constitution. The main difference were features that more closely protected slavery and guaranteed states' rights. Jefferson Davis. On February 9th, 1861, the convention elected Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as provincial president. He seemed a good appointment. Educated at West Point, he had served with distinction in the Mexican War and had been a successful Secretary of War. Although a champion of Southern rights, he had worked hard to maintain national unity. Alexander Stephens from Georgia became vice president as a leading anti-secessionist. He seemed the logical choice to attract co-operationists to the new government. Davis' cabinet was made up of men from each Confederate state. In his inaugural speech, Davis asked only that the Confederacy be left alone. His aim was simply to create a viable new nation. The Upper South. In January 1861, the state legislatures of Arkansas, Virginia, Missouri, Tennessee, and North Carolina called elections for conventions to decide on secession. The results of these elections proved that the Upper South was far less secessionist inclined than the Lower South. In Virginia, only 32 immediate secessionists won seats in the convention with 152 members. Tennessee and North Carolina had referendums which opposed conventions being held. Arkansas voted for a convention, but the delegates voted to reject secession. Secessionists made no headway in Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, or Kentucky. The Upper South states did not vote immediately for secession for a number of reasons. These states had a smaller stake in slavery than the Lower South. Less than a third of the Upper South's population was black. Many non-slaveholders questioned how well their interests could be served as a planter-dominated Confederacy. Serving in a planter-dominated Confederacy, the Upper South had close ties with the North, and thus more reason to fear the economic consequences of recession. In many respects, the results of the Upper South's voting came as no surprise. The majority of its voters had supported Bell and Douglas in 1860, not Breckinridge. Nevertheless, if they were forced to choose between the Union and the Confederacy, many in the Upper South would put
loyalty to their state before loyalty to the Union. The search for compromise. Lincoln did not take over un- until March 1861. In the meantime, Brunschmann continued as president. Blaming the Republicans for the crisis, he did little to stem the secession tide. His main concern was not to provoke war. He thus took an action as federal institutions across the South, forts, custom houses, and post offices were taken over by Confederate states. Bunchman has been criticizing for not doing more to seek a compromise, but it is difficult to see what he could have done given that Republicans did not trust him in the lower South and was set upon leaving the Union. Congressional efforts. Congress met in December. Most congressmen from the Confederate states did not attend, and those who did soon left. However, Northern Democrats and representatives from the Upper South hoped to work out a compromise. The House Committee, with 33 members, proved to be cumbersome. The Senate committed 13, on which Kentucky Unionist John Crittenden played a significant role, was more effective. It recommended a package of compromise proposals. The main idea was to extend the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific, giving the South some hope of slavery expansion. Slavery would be recognized south of 3630 in all present territories as well as those hereafter acquired. A constitutional amendment would guarantee that there would be no interference with slavery in these states where it already existed. Congress would not be allowed to abolish slavery in Washington. Republicans, whose strength in Congress had grown significantly with the withdrawal of Southern delegates, rejected the proposals, which seemed to be more like a surrender than a compromise. Lincoln's position. Up to 1860, slavery had been the main issue dividing North and South. That had now been replaced by secession. While there were some Northerners who thought that the erring Confederate states should be allowed to go in peace, most were unwilling to accept the dismemberment of the USA or allow the great experiment in self-government to collapse. The doctrine of secession is anarchy, declared a Cincinnati newspaper. If the minority have the right to break up the government at pleasure because they have not had their way, there is an end of all government. Few Republicans, however, demanded the swift dispatch of troops to suppress the rebellion. There was an appreciation that precipitous action might have a disastrous impact on the Upper South. The best seemed to be avoid provocation, hoping that the lower South could see sense and return to the Union. Lincoln thought it best to maintain a strict silence until his inauguration. While he was ready to make some concessions to the South, he refused to budge on the territorial question. He believed that he had won the 1860 election on the principles fairly stated that was determined not to concede too much. If we surrender, it is the end of us, he said. Like many Republicans, he exaggerated the strength of Union feeling in the South. He thought that secession was a plot by a small group of planters. His hope that inactively might allow Southern Unionists a chance to
rally and overthrow the extremes was naive. But this probably made little difference even with hindsight. It is difficult to see what Lincoln could have said or done before he became president that would have changed matters. Lincoln's inauguration. On March 4th, 1861, Lincoln became president. His inaugural speech was conciliatory but firm. He said that he would not interfere with the slavery where it already existed, nor would he take immediate action to reclaim federal property or appoint federal officials to the South. However, he made it clear that in his view the Union was unbreakable and the secession was illegal. He thus intended to hold, occupy, and possess federal property within the seceded states. He ended with the words below. Most Republicans liked Lincoln's first term. Border states, Unionists, and many Northern Democrats approved of his attempts at conciliation. Unfortunately, the speech had no impact whatsoever in the Confederate States. Fort Sumter and its impact. Over the winter, and the Confederacy had taken over most of the virtually unmanned forts and arsenals in the South. There were two exceptions, Fort Pickett's and Fort Summers. Both forts were on islands. Pickett's off Pensacola, Florida, was out of range of shore batteries and could easily be reinforced by the Federal Navy. Sumter, in the middle of Charleston Harbor, was a more serious problem. Union troops in Sumter, led by Major Robert Anderson, an ex-Kentucky slaveholder, numbered less than 100. By March 1861, Fort Sumter had become the symbol of national sovereignty for both sides. If the Confederacy was to lay claim to the full rights of a sovereign nation, it could hardly allow a foreign fort in the middle of one of its main harbors. Lincoln had made it clear in his inaugural speech that he intended to hold on to what remained of federal property in the South. Retention of Sumter was thus a test of his credibility. Lincoln's position in March 1861. Lincoln had spoken as he did at his inauguration, believing that time was on his side. But within hours of his speech, he learned that Sumter garrison would run out of food in under 6 weeks. Lincoln, aware that any attempt to supply Sumter might spark war, sought the advice of General-in-Chief Winfield Scott. Sumter's evacuation, Scott informed Lincoln, was almost inevitable. It could not be held without a large fleet and 25,000 soldiers, neither of which the USA possessed. On March 15th, Lincoln brought the matter before his cabinet. Most favored withdrawal. Lincoln put off making an immediate decision. In the meantime, he sent trusted observers to Charleston to assess the situation. In late March, Lincoln called another cabinet meeting to discuss the crisis. By now, the fact-finding mission to Charleston had returned and reported finding no support for the Union whatsoever. The hope was that Unionist sentiment would prevail was thus gone. Moreover, Northern newspapers were now demanding that Sumter be held. Heedful of Northern opinion, most of the cabinet favored resupplying Sumter. Lincoln acts. On April 4th, 1861, Lincoln informed Anderson that a relief expedition would soon be coming and that he should try to hold out. 2 days later, he sent a letter to South Carolina's governor telling him that he intended to resupply Sumter. A small naval expedition, 3 ships and some 500 men, left for Charleston on April 9th. It had been claimed that Lincoln deliberately maneuvered the Confederacy into firing the first shots. More likely, he was simply trying to keep as many options open as possible.
He hoped to preserve peace, but was willing to risk war. By attempting to resupply Sumter, he put the responsibility for starting a conflict into Davis, the Confederate leader who now had to decide what to do. If he gave orders to fire on boats carrying food for hungry men, this was likely to unite Northern opinion and possibly keep the Upper South loyal. On April 9th, Davis cabinet men, most members thought that the time had come to take action against Fort Sumter. Moreover, a crisis might bring the Upper South into the Confederacy. Thus, David ordered that Sumter must be taken before it was resupplied. General Garrard, commander of Confederate forces in Charlestown, was to demand that Anderson evacuate the fort. If Anderson refused, then Bridgewood's orders were to reduce Sumter. The first shots of the war. On April 11th, the general demanded Sumter's surrender. Anderson refused. Negotiations dragged on for several hours but got nowhere. And so, at 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, the opening shots of the Civil War were fired. For 33 hours, Sumter's defense exchanged artillery fire with Confederate land batteries. Extraordinarily, there were no deaths. The relief expedition arrived too late and was too small to affect proceedings. On April 13th, with fires raging through the fort, Anderson surrendered. The attack on Sumter angered and aroused the North. In New York, a city which had previously tended to be pro-Southern, 250,000 people turned out for a Union rally. There can be no neutrals in this war, only patrons or traitors, thundered Senator Douglas. On April 15th, Lincoln issued a call to arms. He asked for 75,000 men for 90 days. Davis called for 100,000 men. Such was the enthusiasm that men rushed to join the Union and Confederate armies. Secession, the second wave. Given that Lincoln called on all Union states to send men to put down the rebellion, the upper Southern states had to commit themselves. Virginia's decision was crucial. Its industrial capacity was as great as the 7 original Confederate states combined. A state convention voted by 88 votes to 55 to support its southern brothers. A referendum in May ratified this decision, with Virginians voting by 128,884 votes to 32,134 to secede. Richmond, Virginia's capital, now became the Confederate capital. In May, Arkansas and North Carolina joined the Confederacy. In June, Tennessee voted by 104,913 votes to 47,238 to secede. However, support for the Confederacy in the Upper South was far from total. West Virginia, now seceded from Virginia, and remained in the Union. More importantly, 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, did not secede. Summary. For many Southerners, the election of a Republican presidency in 1860 was the last straw, an affront to their honor. So, following the example of South Carolina, the 7 states of the Deep South seceded. They formed the Confederacy, and Jefferson Davis became their president. He hoped that the North would accept the new states, but expected that the Confederacy would have to fight to establish its independence. Lincoln did not accept that the Southern states could secede. All efforts at compromise failed. War came when Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter in April 1861. 4 of the upper South states now joined the Confederacy. 4 others remained in the Union. Chapter summary. The USA was far from united in the mid-19th century. Slavery was the key divisive issue. Southerners defended their peculiar institution. Northern
abolitionists condemned it. Western expansion was a crucial issue. Problems arising from Western expansions, particularly resulting from the Mexican War, led to serious sectional confrontations. The 1850 Compromise contained the immediate danger. However, the Kansas-Nebraska Act 1854 reignited sectional tensions. Section. The events in Bleeding Kansas ensured that the Republican Party emerged as the main opponent of the Democrats. The election of Democrat James Brunsham as president in 1856 averted sectional crises, but Brunsham's leadership, especially with regard to Kansas, alienated Northerners. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, 1859, raised tensions to new heights. Following the election of Republican Abraham Lincoln in 1860, 7 lower states seceded from the Union and created the Confederacy. The Confederacy attack on Fort Sumter led to the outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861. 4 Upper South states now joined the Confederacy.